Okay, so welcome back to We Want More. Today we're discussing Chapter 6, which I think is about as long as the first 5 chapters put together. So, Brian, what'd you think?
I'm not sure how. I thought many things. Mostly I kept wondering, like, I think broadly speaking, I would say I don't like Harry in Chapter 6 nearly as much as I liked Harry in Chapter 5. So we'll talk about it as we go. There were points in this chapter where he was kind of a douchebag.
Nice.
Um,
Yeah, I think Harry didn't
so
like
we'll
Harry
see.
as much in this chapter either.
I guess, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah, so refresh, this all runs together in my head. How did we actually start? Because we were already in Diagon Alley at the end of 5.
Let's see, I think it ended with him at the robe shop after that incident with Draco Malfoy.
Ah, that's right. The whole. Okay, so then
Oh, yeah.
it's just McGonagall and Harry like basically trying to finish out his shopping list.
Yeah, and while they're walking from
Uh,
store to store, he's going through his
mhm.
pouch and dropping off cash and picking it back up and
Oh yeah,
trying to.
so he already got the pouch, and then he's basically just sort of like playing with it. Well, and that was one of the things I noticed is that like the way he's playing with it. We're both computer programmers. It was like he's just like fiddling with the thing like it's a program. Like he's like, let me see what it does if I do this. Let me see what it does if I do that. He's like testing it.
Exactly, and he's trying to
In a very
find consistent test cases where it'll pass or fail, and he becomes quickly frustrated by the fact that it doesn't seem to have coherent rules.
Yeah, it like has rules, but then they're not. I guess that would probably, if it was just random, it probably would have annoyed him less. But it seems to definitely have rules, and then it decides whether or not it feels like following them.
Yeah, so like
And
he
I didn't.
tries.
I came after the fact that because I didn't get. It, I'm like, is this some kind of magical word? Because he asks the bag. He's like, give me a bag of okane. I'm like, is that some weird magic thing that I like wasn't paying attention? And it turns out no, he's like speaking Japanese to his bag because Harry is a weeboo.
That's completely fair. He's more of a
Of all
weeb
the
than I
ways,
am
because
because he at least
I
speaks
don't
enough
know.
Japanese to know what gold is.
I guess so. Is that? Yeah, I don't even know. This is just that theoretically, I too am a weeboo, and I took a year of Japanese in college, but not enough that I recognize the word okane. But
Nice. So yeah, it does work when he says it in Japanese, but it doesn't work when he says tokens of economic exchange. And then
yeah,
he asks McGonagall, "Hey, can you give me 2 words, one for gold, one for something that isn't gold, and have it in a language I don't know?" And so she gives him ahava and zahav, which is Hebrew, and the other word is love. And he says bag of zahav, and the gold pops out, and it turns out that it's gold. Or excuse me, that yeah, zahav is gold. And
so yeah, so then it turns out like the bag speaks any language, but it didn't. But he couldn't describe what he wanted.
yeah,
So it seems like it's almost on purpose that these like that he's giving it like some like the way he wrote the way that this bag would work is like it's trying to follow some kind of logic, but is doing it in like an irritatingly inconsistent manner.
yeah, that sounds about right. Um, it's I like the quote where Harry thought over his collected experimental data. It was only the most crude and preliminary sort of effort, but it was enough to support at least one conclusion. Ah, this doesn't make any sense. So,
It's weird. I keep going back and forth between like when he'll do, especially because like if he'll go right in the middle of my nerd wheelhouse, like I'll find that stuff really amusing and like engaging, and then there's other times where he'll pull this like like the irritating kind of nerd. I'm like, oh my god, I want to punch this kid.
yeah,
So I keep going back and forth. It's kind of interesting where I'm
no, I
the
can
way
feel
I
it.
keep reacting to things.
I think for him, it's like this. He's trying to figure out just the basics. It's. I mean, just imagine how frustrated you'd be if you started at a new job and you're trying to write test cases in a language you don't know, like Go, and the test cases were this obtuse, and you're like, "What the hell are you doing?" Except for him, he's trying to figure out how the universe actually works, and is just throwing shit in his face.
I think that's kind of what makes it work well with when it's magic stuff is that it really can like if we were trying to have this actually be like quote science like it would be harder to work in what kind of weird little gimmicks we want with how he's interacting with these things, but because it is magic it can be sort of ridiculously inconsistent in a way that only could be because somebody was trying to make it interesting, but it doesn't really matter because like maybe the guy who made the magic spell decided that he wanted it to speak languages, but it's not smart enough to understand what you mean. So all that kind of stuff works.
Interesting. Yeah, that sounds like that could be what's going on. It certainly beats McGonagall's answer of just magic. And Harry's like, that's just
See,
a
I keep
word.
liking it. Yeah, but so that kind of leads into what I was thinking. Yeah, and so he's talking to her about like as he's trying to like figure out how this thing works, and then that sort of like moves into him trying to draw this larger picture of like, okay, I walked into this wizarding world, and they have all these new ways that or new to me ways that the world works, and he starts to he's trying to think about how as he's trying to figure out the limits and just sort of like the rules of how magic works, that he's seeing that like McGonagall doesn't know, and at least to him it appears like she doesn't care, and I think he uses the word like incurious about her. And I was wondering, this might be a good point for me to read this part that I saw. So he asked her how it worked, and she basically gave him the same answer of, well, it's magic. And so he says, Professor McGonagall undoubtedly knew every last detail of how you went about turning into a cat, but she seemed to have literally never heard of the scientific method. To her it was just muggle magic, and she didn't even seem curious about what secrets might be hiding behind the natural language understanding of the retrieval charm. And what I thought as I was reading that was, I'm wondering to what level, like how dumb are we supposed to think the wizarding world is? Like how much of this like boy genius superhero is Harry, and the wizarding world is really dumb? Or are we going to later? I guess what I was thinking was maybe we're going to see that there's some perfectly good reason, or at least some explainable reason for why she can't just sort of explain the why of how things are working. That there's some reason better than, because they're dumb and Harry's smart.
Yeah, yeah, I think, and this is like my thoughts as I was reading this chapter. It seems like there's a couple of possibility or a couple of angles to approach this from. So one of them is like it could just be that it's just not part of the magical curriculum of the education system to like understand the why of things, and it's more just about understanding the how and the what of things, kind of like primary school. In if you're taking a science class, you have to be able to answer multiple choice test on what happens if you combine these two elements maybe, but you don't have to really get it. You just have to be able to know what happens at a surface level, right? So yeah, it could be that they aren't brought up with like the principle of understand why, and just more of the here's how things work. I'm trying like there is a charitable way to view that doesn't make them stupid. It just like humans 500 years ago were stupid in the sense that they maybe were credulous and didn't really think about why are things working this way, and they would just be not even inclined to ask like, hey, why does I don't know, what's a natural phenomena that everybody saw back then that was mysterious, like maybe an eclipse or something.
Rainbows.
What was that?
Rainbows.
Yeah, perfect. So it could be kind of like that.
Yeah. But but it's different to some extent, because that's people are ignorant, and not ignorant in some sort of like judgment. They literally, there are things they don't know yet, and that same excuse wouldn't apply to Wizarding World. They're not ignorant or incapable. They're more capable of finding out these things. So it sounds, I mean, we don't yet know enough yet, or at least I don't, because I've only read through chapter 6. But like, is the reason they don't know these things because of just this rampant incuriosity in Wizarding World? Or what I kept wondering at was, are we going to run into something that sort of explains why this behavior makes sense even among relatively intelligent people that aren't just these sort of incurious slobs? And I guess what I'm sort of like starting to sidle up to as I'm reading this is like, because I probably mentioned this a few times, there's this kind of stuff is bothering me with how Harry behaves, because it sounds so familiar with ways that I act sometimes, and it's those things that I don't like about how I act, because Harry's kind of coming across as like the arrogant little know-it-all fuck that like enjoys occasionally condescending to the people around him in order to like, in this really sort of like low self-esteem kind of way, like to make him feel better about himself. And having just said that, I'm like, wow, am I projecting?
He does
But
the
and so that's what I'm getting at. But it also is like, oh, like this is my world. These are my people. So like we do this. This is a thing we do a lot. And so I'm wondering, like, is that? So I haven't been able to tell. Is this something that's being consciously done by the author, or is this just like that he's another guy like me that goes off this way on people? And so I'm still not sure yet. But that's what I keep getting at. Is to what extent is are we're kind of like walking this line between like Harry the Ravenclaw, which we'll get to in a second. We're very explicitly saying Harry's going to be Raven here later, but is it that like Harry the Ravenclaw, or is it an intentional? I guess is it the intent of the author for this to bother me, or is that just the way it is? I guess, and so I'm still like that's what's kind of bubbling in the back of my brain as I'm reading this.
Yeah, it's not quite clear if the author is trying to annoy you or trying to make Harry annoying or is projecting himself as he would imagine himself feeling if he was. I think the other thing to consider here too is that for more or less, other than maybe being a bit wittier and more mature-ish, maybe is a way to put it. McGonagall seems almost exactly the same as she does in the canon books, right?
That's true. Yeah.
In that series, nobody was curious why, when you waved your wand and said Wingardium Leviosa the right way, stuff floated, right? It was just like, this just happens.
Is that? I guess I'm trying to think back. I guess because it's not something that it's not like an important issue as like the plot we're dealing with in the original books. But is it that they like don't care, or is it almost just like, well, everybody knows this and that's like not important? It's because it's not like you and I are discussing, how are the electrons flowing through these cords that we're talking to, and there's an internet that's communicating these things across. Like those are just sort of known and part of the atmosphere that we're in.
Exactly. I think that's the way that's how I view the wizards viewing magic is like I flick the switch in this room and the light comes on, and unless I'm inclined to learn more, I don't really care or need to understand more than that. I know that if I want to be able to see, I can turn the light on or I flick that switch and I can see. So I mean, substituting technology for magic, my spell is flicking that switch and boom, the room is full of light. And unless I'm just not curious, then there's nothing more for me to be concerned with.
Yeah, I guess what I was thinking was that it might be more that because that's just wasn't part of, not essential to the plot as in the original books, that I guess my impression was more like they probably do know all those things, but they're just not constantly discussing them, or just like you and I and electricity. When I flip on the lights, I think I have a fairly good understanding of how the electricity is flowing around in my house. So I know like what goes on when I flip switches, but I'm not thinking about it all the time. And I'm probably not expert, but I know a fair amount.
Yeah, you probably know more than I do. And that said, I mean, if I needed to wire a room myself, I couldn't do it. I know what wires look like. I would know what a broken light looks like, but I don't know enough about the underlying physics of electricity and the metals involved in the light bulbs to like make my own stuff, right? So it could just sort of be where she's not. So I think Harry kind of puts it down in a nice quote here. He's like, possibility one. Magic was so incredibly opaque, convoluted, and impenetrable that even though wizards and witches had tried their best to understand, they had made little or no progress and eventually given up, and Harry would do no better. Or Harry cracked his knuckles in determination, but they made a quiet sort of clicking sound rather than echoing ominously off of Diagon Alley. Possibility two, he'd be taking over the world.
Or possibility three, you're an 11-year-old kid and not as smart as you think you are, and there is some grown-up reason that people behave this way that explains it all, but you just don't know it yet. That's what
It is safe to assume
that's sort of my grumpy old man to look at it. I'm like, is that possibly the simplest explanation, that you're just a kid and there's a lot you don't know yet?
That does seem like a nice parsimonious explanation, and it is not one that did occur to Harry yet. I think in his line of thinking is that, hey, I'm old enough and smart enough already to understand the laws of physics as Muggles understand them. There's no way magic is more convoluted than this or something. But yeah, it could be that, possibility three, that this is just, there's some other explanation there and Harry is just completely missing it. So he's baffled by the lack of investigation into science, or into, like, I guess the science of how magic works. The magical world as he's seen it so far seems ridiculously unconcerned with people understanding the underlying rules, which in his defense, or I guess in the defense of magical Britain, the only person he's interacted with is Professor McGonagall, who, while being talented and smart, maybe this just isn't something she cares about. I know lots of smart people who don't care about how electricity works. It could be analogous to that. Just trying not to be uncharitable to
Yeah.
Professor McGonagall.
Yeah, and I'm like really because you sort of know the answer to this is the you can't tell me like how this vibe plays out for the rest of the book. Um, but yeah, I don't know yet because this like if part of what goes on with the rest of the story is like Harry working out where like maybe 20 chapters from now Harry's like, huh, I have been kind of like arrogantly assuming I know everything here, and I didn't really, and like him working that part of his personality out, that would be kind of really interesting and cool. So I don't know.
All I can say is that it wouldn't
So,
be a good story if there wasn't character growth.
there you go.
So I'm hoping that he doesn't. If he was this condescending and this mature, especially after more than 20 minutes of playing with one magical artifact, I guess we'll just have to see where it goes. So there's other fun little quotes, and this is some of just the levity that I like, and this is like we kind of talked about. The first four-ish chapters didn't. They were still kind of getting their sea legs, I think, as far as what the story was going to be like, but he has this thought after he decides that he might take over the world where, first of all, she asks him, or no, wait, that's later. So let's see. Oh, yeah, he's thinking, he says, you're mine now, as he thought to to Diagon Alley, to the British, wizarding Britain into the entire universe, which Muggle scientists understood so much less than they believed. I, Harry James Potter Evans Varys, do now claim this territory in the name of science.
Science.
And lightning and thunder completely failed to flash and boom in the cloudless skies. And then she asks him,
I highlighted that one too.
isn't that great?
One of my favorite parts.
And then he makes a note to memorize that so future historians look at that line, right? But she's like, what are you smiling about? Kind of like weary and wary, and he's like, oh, I'm wondering if there's a spell to make lightning flash, never make an ominous resolution. And then this little bit of kind of childishness on him, but it's intentional and adorable. It was like, she's like, I have the distinct feeling I ought to be doing something about this, and oh, ignore it, it'll go away. Ooh, shiny.
Ooh, shiny.
Go looking off.
I like these parts with these like winking to the camera kind of stuff, like the because he's almost talking about like meta, like, oh, I'm in this book, so I got to make sure that I remember this time when I say the right momentous sounding thing.
Yeah, there's definitely a component of like genre savviness to him, which is the trope of the character has read books like the story that he's in, so he's like, well, when I read fantasy books, this is the sort of thing that happens. And I haven't read enough characters that are genre savvy to like, or at least that are explicitly genre savvy to know how hard of a line this is to walk, but he does it in a way where it's not, he doesn't lean into the fourth wall at all, but he's like, oh, this is he'll like call out tropes to himself.
Yeah,
So,
and he's doing a good job of like, because yeah, you do have to strike a balance there, but he's doing it. It feels like he's doing it fairly naturally, like he's not having to calculate very hard about what's the right way to do this stuff, because it comes up really well. It's sort of funny and light, and it's right after this that Harry refers to his pouch as Harry's bag of holding.
yes.
There's been quite a few D&D nods going on here.
Yeah, I think that was it in the last chapter when they first got there, and he's like looking at stuff, and he's like, this looks like stuff that would fit in a game of D&D, which he said that he hadn't played, but he'd read the manuals of because he had been interested in the game. But I think this is me purely speculating, but I think it's safe to say that he didn't play much because you need friends to play D&D with. So,
Oh yeah, because he's the homeschool kid.
yeah, and
Forgot about that.
as we talk about a bit later, he doesn't really have friends. Like he's, like you pointed out, he's an arrogant asshole, but he's 11, and so like the other 11-year-olds he hangs out with at, presumably if he goes to community functions or whatever, they're not playing on his level, right? So they're not gonna.
I realized we're walking through this today that like my daughter is 11 years old. She just turned 11, so I realized like, oh, I can like start comparing these things back to, and maybe that's why some of this stuff rings fairly off, is that like the way he's talking versus even you're going to stretch it into like he's this ubermensch little kid, like some of this like, okay, he's 11, man. So
Yeah, it's curious to see how that'll play out because Draco seems to if he wasn't playing the science game as at the same level as Harry, he was playing the wit and I don't know ability to follow a second level conversation with, right? So
And I
that
can't remember. Is Harry supposed to be 11 years old in the beginning of the first book? In the original books,
yes,
because yeah, I would say because obviously in the movie, he's a lot older than that because it's movies. But I would say like even in my own recollection of how that worked, like he was definitely like young pubescent kind of vibe. But I like if you were gonna make me, nail it down, I would have guessed he was like 13ish, just from how he feels in the books.
I'm
So
trying to remember.
what's this? Because I guess I'm just sort of relating it back to just regular school. Is what grade quote is Harry supposed to be in? Is this because if he's 11, that would be like sixth grade,
Yeah, fifth and sixth
or
grade, I
fifth grade
think.
even, fifth and sixth grade. Is that like the age of? Because what are they? But they're 7 years, right?
Right. I think magical schooling
Yeah, that's
goes
about
through
right.
like
Yeah,
10 or
sixth
11
grade.
through 17 or 18.
Yeah, because he turned 17 at the end. Because I can't remember exactly that like gets him out of some rules of things he wasn't allowed to do before.
I think underage magic or something is how the seventh book
Something like
opens.
that.
Yeah.
There's that, and there's something about like I think teleporting or something when they're
Yeah.
or apparating.
Which I guess is teleporting with a pop. I'm not sure what the
Yeah.
difference is, but yeah.
That's a more Latin-y sounding
That's
kind of
true.
teleporting.
So, book wise, the next thing that happens is they go to, they're at some, I don't know, store, and he's trying to buy this emergency healing pack plus. And
Oh yeah.
he goes on to describe the contents of it, and a lot of it doesn't really matter, except for I guess the nod here, which Dementor exposure treatment, which looked and smelled like ordinary chocolate, which we know because we read Harry Potter that it
Because
is.
it's ordinary chocolate. Uh-huh.
But so it goes on to describe that there's a bunch of ingredients which tell us that this is a extremely extensive emergency kit, and Professor McGonagall is giving him this weary look, or I guess what he describes as the evil eye, and she's like, "Why do you need a healer's kit?" And why do you expect to need one? She says. He's like, "I don't expect to need it. It's just in case." In case of what?
This one, I mean, and not at all in a bad way, but I kept thinking as I was reading this, I'm like, oh, Harry is just neurotic. This wasn't like, it totally worked. It's like, it didn't like pull me out of the reality. It was like, oh, this kid is like weirdly neurotic with like this, like, what do they call it? Like hypervigilance or something. Like he's always worried that like something bad is going to happen, but not in any sort of PTSD way, but just like this kid worries too much. I
Yeah,
mean, it was both like, it struck me as like, okay, this is weird and off, but it also worked in that like, I was actually believing this real kid is really weird and off and what's going on with him.
I agree that for a kid, it's certainly weird behavior. I'm not quite this level of prepared in my usual life, but I do have lots of contingencies for things. I mean, the trunk of my car has, I think, two backup pairs of shoes, like jumper kit. It's got all. I mean, my trunk barely has room for groceries because it's full of crap. And if I had a magical bag of holding, you can bet I'd have a medical kit in there. But yeah, for an 11-year-old, it's weird, right? And so
Yeah, and it does work with like the with his weird control freaky vibe is like because McGonagall asks him, she's like, "Why are you thinking about all these things?" He says, "So I can stop it from happening." Like I don't know if he like thinks he's going to be able to like control every event in his universe or well, I mean, it does sound like he thinks that like if he can just think hard enough about everything that he can prevent anything bad from happening, which is totally neurotic and bizarre. But it worked. It's like I really believe that he thought that.
it's funny because
So
that's how I think. But that said, it doesn't sound like the normal thought patterns of an 11-year-old who isn't like post trauma, which,
yeah,
so like, all right, what the hell did you endure to make you this way is like the completely natural line of thought if you're watching an 11-year-old act
yeah.
this sort of defensive. And he's like, oh, that's what you're thinking when I bought the feather falling potion, the gillyweed, and all, the food and water pills and all this stuff. And he's like, what sort of plan do you think I have going here? She says, I don't know, but it either ends in you delivering a ton of silver to Gringotts or in world domination. World domination is such an ugly phrase. I prefer to call it world optimization.
As we were watching, actually, I really liked this part of it, and I was as I was sort of moving that conversation forward in my head, and it doesn't look like they got to where I was thinking about this, but what it kept bringing to mind for me was like Harry's doing all this worrying in hope of preventing something bad. And I kept picturing like McGonagall maybe saying to him, "It's like this that worry is a cost you're paying," and I think like from Harry's point of view, it just sounds like, well, no, if I can just like control this stuff, I'll prevent something bad from happening, and then that'll be worth it. And sort of, overlooking that, like all of that worrying is making you miserable, and that is a cost you are constantly paying, hoping that it will prevent one single bad thing from happening. I
Yeah.
don't know. That just sort of like goes in my sort of broader view of like where our world is going with, Facebook trying to make us all worry about what kind of toothpaste we're using.
Yeah, I think his view, which admittedly doesn't make sense for an 11-year-old, is like, or not admittedly, this isn't a fault in the story. The story may or may not address why he's this way or whatever, right? But and that's not me being cryptic. It's just like we haven't read the rest. We don't know why, what the hell's going on with him, right? It's like if you're in the car with somebody, my mom's gotten better at this, but certainly shortly after she got a smartphone, she was a pretty bad driver. And if I'm in the car with her, I would do things like watch the road while she's driving and I have like a contingency plan where if she goes, starts doing something stupid, well, I can slide the car into neutral and I can grab the e-brake and that'll slow us down. Like, and those are things I can do from the passenger seat. And so like I think of things to kind of again, so I anticipate something bad happening and I think of a way to fix it. And to me, that seems perfectly natural. And it's sort of like Harry, it doesn't seem like it's causing him a lot of distress. He describes, this to him, well, to us too at the time, kind of funny way of like when he might need this kit. And it's like I think I can get that, but I don't think I was that neurotic as an 11-year-old. And that said,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem like his neurosis here is causing him that much consistent anguish. It's just like, no, this is part of what you do as a responsible person. You think of what negative things can happen and you stop
That's what
them.
was funny about it, though, is that was like my reaction to it was like, oh wow, this kid's like profoundly neurotic. And I want to say again, like it totally worked. Like I was in it, like believing that this is a thing that's really happening. I guess it sort of makes me think like we don't think as we're doing it that there's any sort of like cost to us taking off our shoes before we get on an airplane, and that it's making the world safer, except like not really, and maybe it is just a little bit, but like this not acknowledging that there's this like cumulative effect to every weird little thing we worry about, that not that the worrying is not worth doing in some cases, but like we're not looking at both sides of that, and we're like, if I've got X amount of worry to spread around, am I spending it foolishly?
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying.
So I don't know. I mean, I just like I like that it was sort of interesting. It was making me think about that, and and it seems definitely like this is part of who this character is. So we're gonna see more of this.
Yeah. And
So
I think we will see more of this too. It's she goes on to ask him like, why are you being this way? And he's like, I don't have some crazy dangerous plan. You don't get me at all. Like I'm trying to be safe and prudent and cautious. I'm preparing for unforeseen contingencies. And I sort of get his frustration. Like I have a fire extinguisher in my house. I should probably have two, but I only have one. Which now that I think about it is completely stupid. What if the fire is between me and the fire extinguisher? But I I'll burn that
you've
bridge when I
got
come to
one
it.
more than me.
Yeah.
Ah, that was a good joke. That was
But
solid. That was a solid joke, by the way.
but the it was an accidental joke. I sort of just replaced every time I say it. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. I say we'll burn it, and
Mine
sometimes
is
it's
I'll jump
funny.
off that bridge when I get to it.
I like that one. I'll start using that one at work. So he's thinking like, or so she's like, all right, what sort of contingency can you imagine this kit might prepare you for, young man? And this is that attitude that I think you're expressing, which is completely fair. It's like, dude, you're at school with adults. Like, what do you need to be prepared for? And so he's like, he goes on this little spiel of, well, like, say one of my classmates get bitten by a horrible monster, and as I scrabble frantically in my moleskin pouch for something that could help her, she looks at me sadly, and with her last breath says, why weren't you prepared? And then she dies, and I know as her eyes close that she won't ever forgive me. And then the girl gasps, and he looks at her, and then she kind of flees into the deeper recesses of the shop, and he's like confused. So Professor McGonagall drags him out and puts up a quieting charm, and then she's like, there was a war here 10 years ago, and to speak of people dying, friends dying in your arms, that's not jokes we make. And he's like, oh shit, I get it. Oh man.
Yeah, yeah. This is one of this is like I talk about, like it bothers me because it's so like me that I could totally relate to this. All the times where you like say something, you think you're being all clever and funny, and then you realize you just really hurt somebody's feelings, and you're like the biggest asshole in the universe. Like, oh, like you just it sounded funny to you until you said it out loud.
And then yeah, you weren't thinking of the
So yeah, I was
context,
like,
and yeah.
I was cringing along with him as I was watching. I'm like, oh yeah, I know that feel.
Well, and I had the same laugh cringe response here too, because like his situation's ridiculous and funny, and like especially from again the tropey genre savvy kind of way. Like yeah, that's hilarious. That's exactly what would happen in a story, right? And then she kind of pulls him back, and it's like, this isn't like us, not she doesn't say this, but kind of textually, this isn't a story. This is like there was a war. That's probably why that girl
Yeah,
freaked out and ran away. And he's like, oh shit, she would have been like 7 or 8, 10 years ago, which means that when she saw someone die during this war, she was a child. And oh man, am I the asshole here? And so she tells him like, you've got to learn to think before you speak, Mr. Potter, or you'll also go through life without many friends.
yeah, and I liked it. Like it seemed like he got that. As, like he was like showing some authentic emotion around that, where like he really did feel bad about it.
Yeah, totally. He doesn't seem like a
So I thought that I
psychopath. He
like that.
just seems
Yeah,
like inconsiderate,
not
which
this
is
part.
a big difference. Yeah. So at the very least, he and like you said, it does sort of sink in. Even that lesson of try to think before you speak. He does say at some point in the next few paragraphs where it's like he might not remember that tomorrow, but he can at least remember it for 5 minutes. And she asks why he would say something like that. Why would you even think it? And he's like, I was just trying to imagine the worst case scenario. And he didn't want to say that he had been joking a little bit.
Hmm.
And but why? So I can stop it from happening. And that's sort of that neurotic responsibility
Yeah,
you were talking about. And then this is where she kind of she kneels down beside him, and her voice is more gentle, and she's like, it's not your responsibility to take care of the students, it's mine. I won't let bad stuff happen, and we've got a healer at the school, and you don't need a healer's kit at all. And he's like, but I do, nowhere's safe. And this is sort of him just being
hmm,
um, I don't know, it'd be kind of like, and it's later, oh yeah, it's the next sentence where she's like, you don't need to. So I'm getting ahead of myself. He's like, what if when I go home for Christmas there's an accident? Whatever, my parents have a heart attack. And she's like, why would you think that? There's no need to think about such terrible things. And this is where he gets kind of twisted up and bitter. And he's like, yes, there is. If you don't think, you just get yourself hurt or end up hurting other people. And this could be where like I my mom would never do this, but hypothetically, if my mom was like, "Oh my God, why would you think about buying a fire extinguisher? Thinking about your house burning down is such a terrible thing. That's an awful thought to have." That's sort of what he's feeling like, and he's definitely feeling condescended to. That's not how you talk to an adult, right?
yeah,
If they were being totally over the can't think of the word. If they're being totally crazy about it, and had, I mean, even a panic room sounds really cool to have, but like. I don't know, a gun in every room and two constantly strapped to their person and uh, whatever, a go bag in 3 different locations in their house and just, whatever, over the top preparedness, then that's a point where you might
hmm,
talk with another adult and be like, are you sure you're okay? Um,
yeah.
but you would ask them, like,
And I
are you
think
okay? Yeah.
I think Harry's response to his reaction to this. I think we were supposed to see it as like, okay, this Harry's taking this too far, not in any kind of critical way, but like, oh, this kid is trying to carry the weight of the world on him.
Yeah, I'm talking too much, and that's a good
Yeah.
point. He is. It certainly seems that way. So, yeah, sorry, you summarize what's going on next. I realize I've been rambling, and fuck,
No,
this is your show, so.
it's my show. I didn't know that.
This is our show, but I feel like I've done more than 50% of the talking.
Yeah. And I gotten kind of lost in the jumble of what happens while they're having these conversations. So he's saying that about like he's just trying to prevent every single bad thing in the world happening, and then it gets to another part that was. Oh, and then Harry didn't like himself when he was angry. I thought that was another little shout out to Nerd World. But how does it go? Because then it gets into there's this. Well, we'll just jump. We can jump back if I've jumped too far ahead. But there's this weird part where, again, I think they're talking about like, oh, it's when McGonagall asks him if he wants to get an owl, and he's like, I don't want an owl, I don't want a pet, and the conversation just takes this weird left turn where, like, she's trying to like get Harry to again project himself onto whether or not he was an owl. It basically turns into this weird thing about like, oh, if the owl was starving, that this is somehow like some metaphor for like Harry being abused as a child, and then and I'll read this part that. Harry's anger was spiraling out of control into pure black fury. Don't you ever dare breathe a word. He's sort of corner McGonagall to say like, "Oh, you think my parents abused me?" And she didn't say like directly yes, but basically admitted that that's where she was going. But,
Yeah,
so
right before this,
Harry's anger was,
he drags her by the hand and says, "Can you put up the quiet
yeah,
charm?"
yeah,
And he corners her. Yeah.
yeah. He basically just wants to chew her out, and he's like, "Don't you ever dare breathe a word of these insinuations to anyone. No one, do you hear me, McGonagall? An accusation like that can ruin people and destroy families, even when the parents are completely innocent." This whole thing struck me as bizarre because it kind of came out of nowhere, and why is Harry getting all bent out of shape about it? Was weird. So
Yeah, I guess right before that they have he talks about the planning fallacy, and which is the name of the chapter,
yeah,
because she's asking like, why do you have to be on your guard, and what happens to you? And you pulled this quote out too. It's like, what happened to me is only anecdotal evidence. It doesn't carry
yeah,
the same weight as a replicated peer-reviewed article, blah blah blah, which is hoity-toity sort of stuff. But
hmm,
he's trying to cite that like, no, this isn't just like a me thing. This is a person thing. This is ubiquitous among people that we tend to anticipate that things go really well, but they don't. And
yeah.
so
Which is like sort of the center of everything we've been talking about. I mean, that's kind of the logic behind Harry's worrying.
yeah, but as far as him spiraling out here and doing this like you said, oh, I guess what happens right before that though is that she does kind of convince him to go inside and get the healer's kit. So, or excuse me, he convinces her to let him do that.
Even so, yeah.
But she does say, "I won't let you push me around," and then he's like,
And then she lets him push him around.
"Well," she says, "All right, let's go get it." So she's still in charge, but I
Yeah.
think she had heard his reasoning. It's like, all right, whatever. I'll think about why you're like this, and so then, yeah, they have the conversation about having a pet, and then he says, "You think I was abused?" And then she says, "Were you?" And he's like, "No. What do you think? I'm stupid?" And then, yeah, then he gets, like you said, left field, super pissed, and she goes to try and reach her hands towards him. She's like, "Harry," and he steps back and slaps her hand away, and she's like, "It's all right, I believe you." And he's like, "Do you, or are you just waiting to get away from me so you can file the papers?"
I know it was weird. It was weirdly out of place. It was.
I think what he's
You think
concerned.
like, does the author have a thing going on? Like, is this a thing for you, man? Are you okay? Like,
I think the author knows what he's doing.
do you need to talk to someone?
I think the author's in his 30s, so I think he knows. He's if he needs to talk to somebody, he can. But it's. I think what's happening here is he's seeing like, and he points out that like the system doesn't know how to stop. This was what in the early 90s when these books supposed to take place. So remember like the the daycare demon
Yeah, it was
stuff of the
Nick
80s.
Morton preschool. Yeah, it was like an 80s.
So like he had read about this stuff, and he's like, no, there's if you start breathing this shit around, it's gonna ruin my family and destroy my home, and like the system doesn't know how to stop here. Like, and so, but I get why he kind of freaks out, like as far as like, oh shit, I can't have the school authorities go tell him, the whatever magic police that I'm being abused because they'll destroy my family. But his demeanor is not that of somebody who is like, at least not of an ordinary kid who's like panicking in that sort of
Yeah,
reflex. He seems, just from my read of it, to just be throwing away the whole like, all right, I'm an 11-year-old talking to my adult attendant, and I need to take charge and own this situation, which isn't what kids do, and that's kind of why she freaks out
yeah,
too. And her freak out is more of
yeah,
like demurring and trying to like reassure him, like it's all right, I believe you, it's fine.
yeah.
And then she's
She had the same reaction I did. It was like, dude, chill.
yeah, which tells me at least the author knows that the kid's behavior is unnatural, right? So, which
Yeah, it makes me like I'm wondering now, like, is there going to be some significance to this that we're going to see later? Or, maybe not. I don't know, but
it seems like that's a good question to ask.
yeah.
It's
Oh, I got something. Ding, 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 ding.
well,
Phone
no,
hit.
not necessarily. I'm just it's, but yeah, I mean, like certainly, and McGonagall points this out. It's like, look, I had to ask because something's clearly at work here, and she's like, and he's like what? And she says, I've seen enough
Oh
abused
yeah, she
kids
does
to
say
break
that.
your heart, and they, you act like someone sometimes, only sometimes, that who spent their first 11 years locked in a cellar, which is a nod to the
Yeah,
original Harry Potter.
yeah. Or yeah, it's just she's also planning something here about okay, there's something off about you, more than just regular personality stuff. Like she sees something and like okay, it's not that he was abused, but so yeah. And as we're talking through that, yeah, there is something to this that is going to mean something.
I think, yeah, there's something like that. There's a quote here that I didn't pull out, but where, Harry thinks that if he could have seen his own reflection while he's doing experiments on the pouch, it would look just like McGonagall's face when she's kind of grilling him here. That she's doing the same thing. She's trying to figure out what's going on, and she, at the end of this, says all of that. Like you're a kid, and yet there are times when you're not acting like one, and this is weird, and you have to understand that, right? And so he takes it in, and in fairness, he processes it, and his rage goes away, and um, it dawned on him that he was being listened to respectfully, and that his family wasn't in danger. And then she's like, I don't know, but it's possible that something could have happened that you don't remember. And then his rage comes right
Oh
back, and
yeah.
he's
And she was
like,
right, but then she like makes a completely valid point. Like, well, okay, that's not true, except well, magic.
yeah, he's like, there's
Maybe
such thing
yes,
as
okay, maybe
suppressed
suppressed
memories.
memories aren't true, but
Yeah,
unless somebody casts a spell in which you totally have suppressed memories. He's like, oh, damn.
he's like, oh shit. And then he's trying to analyze this as a good rationalist might try to do. And so, all right, well, how sure of your observations, and what alternative explanations could there be? And she is completely fair. She's like, sure, I'm sure of nothing. I've never met anyone else like you. Sometimes you just don't seem 11 years old or even all that human.
That was a good
I'm
line.
sorry. I was trying to make a point. I'm afraid that came off sounding somewhat different from what I had in mind. On the contrary, Professor McGonagall, I shall take it as a very great compliment. And then he has his own alternative explanation, which you feel free to let me know if you think is good at all. Do you remember that, or you have that pulled up?
What's the no? What's the? I'm getting them all confused. Go ahead and so his alternate explanation for for why she thinks he's odd, basically. What I can't remember what.
And we don't have to analyze it in depth. I just
No,
grabbed
yeah, no. But let me look.
because it's so. I guess the reason it's worth bringing up is just because she's trying to figure out what the hell's going on, and the best that she can think of is like it's possible that you were abused and obliviated, and so it's at least worth
Oh,
raising the
okay.
fact that he
Oh,
has an alternative
I
explanation.
don't. Yeah, I don't think I picked up on that as I was reading it. Okay, that makes more sense.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I didn't really get this as his sort of like his his understanding of himself. Um, okay, so yeah, so they're kind of going back and forth about, McGonagall's trying to figure out how is he, basically, why are you so weird, Harry? It must be because you're abused. Well, no, okay, you're not abused, and so then it's Harry sort of talking about his own understanding of why he behaves the way he does, and he's basically just saying it's sort of him acknowledging his own Ravenclawishness. So I'll go ahead and read what he says right after she calls him almost not human. He says, "Children aren't meant to be too much smarter than their parents," Harry said, "or too much saner, maybe. My father could probably outsmart me if he was, actually trying, instead of using his adult intelligence mainly to come up with new reasons not to change his mind." Harry stopped. "I'm too smart, Professor. I've got nothing to say to normal children. Adults don't respect me enough to really talk to me. And frankly, even if they did, they wouldn't sound as smart as Richard Feynman. So I might as well read something Richard Feynman wrote instead. I'm isolated, Professor McGonagall. I've been isolated my whole life. Maybe that has some of the same effects as being locked in a cellar. And I'm too intelligent to look up to my parents the way that children are designed to do. My parents love me, but they don't feel obliged to respond to reason, and sometimes I feel like they're the children. Children who won't listen about absolute authority over my whole existence. I try not to be too bitter about it, but I also try to be honest with myself. So yes, I'm bitter. And I also have an anger management problem, but I'm working on it. That's all." So it's sort of, I mean, it is kind of a good, like, self-awareness of, like, Harry knows that he acts a certain way. But I think more of the point of what he's just trying to say is that, he's not, there's not some, overly complicated or, sinister reason for how he acts. He's just sort of aware. He's like, okay, I'm the smart, he's basically saying I'm the smart homeschooled kid. And that's left me kind of, isolated, and that is why I'm interacting with you in this way.
Yeah,
Um,
and it's an interesting take. I didn't mean to cut you off. What were you gonna say?
No, go ahead.
Like you said, it doesn't have to be anything sinister. It could just be I'm too smart for my own good and too smart to, uh, whatever, carry on a conversation with an average 11-year-old. But even McGonagall's like, that's all, and he's like, that's all. Surely even in magical Britain, the normal explanation is always worth considering. Um,
Yeah.
so it his he
Yeah, and it's good, and at least it sort of shows like, okay, yes, this is how Harry is, and so he's sort of owning that. Okay, this is the kind of character that we're dealing. Both like plot wise, like the author's telling us, okay, this is who Harry is. This is the point we're starting from with this character, but then also like showing like Harry has his own awareness of what that is. So as we're talking through this, it sort of clears up for me, like, okay, how much of this is on purpose, and how much of this is just, how it's getting written unintentionally. It sounds like, okay, we're working on this. This is intentionally being put there.
I think, and you're the literary analysis half of this partnership. So, but my take is that the author knows what they're doing, and this is sort of that principle of charity that I outlined in the last episode, which is just at least until you've seen the whole thing and can assess it on every aspect of it, just sort of assume that this was on purpose. Yeah, so certainly McGonagall notices Harry's weird. Harry notices that Harry is weird, and naturally, McGonagall goes to a magical explanation, and Harry thinks of a mundane one, or mundane on the context of they're magicians. Yeah, so let's see. The next up, oh, he gets his wand.
Yeah, yeah. As we're talking about this, it's just like this chapter is a little hard to piece together because, as far as I think you were calling it earlier, storyboard, like actual events here don't happen. There's a lot of important kind of character development stuff, but the order of events and things happening and what things they're talking about don't necessarily have to follow one from the other. So it's kind of easy for this to turn into a jumble.
Yeah, they're essentially in like three locations throughout the longest chapter of the book so far,
Yeah.
which is the shop, the alleyways, and the wand shop, right? So yeah, most of it is just I think this is and this is kind of a long chapter. I think partly just because the author maybe wanted to get out of Diagon Alley, but
Yeah.
like you said, maybe I think you said last time, maybe they're just eager to get him to Hogwarts. I'm not sure because they do that time jump, from when she shows up in the
Yeah.
middle of the summer to it's a week before school starts.
Well, and also like this, like in the original books, all of this Diagon Alley, like we have to paint a world to give us a whole background on how everything works. But if you're reading this, fan fiction, we all know how this, how the world looks and how it works. Like we know, so it's just, get forward to the part that's new for us. So it's more like you have to just kind of work through. It's almost like the Diagon Alley part of it as a plot is just kind of a checkbox we have to fill out and work. So we're doing these character development things as we're going through, but it's not really important for us as the reader to like know all the things that are at Diagon Alley. Like we know what's there and how that works.
Yeah, that's a good point. And
So
I forgot actually when I had my list of like, here's what I want in the co-host of the show to have, I forgot to add they should have read the original Harry Potter books or at least seen the movies.
well, that was lucky.
Yeah, that lucked out. Especially time-wise when you just finished reading them to your daughters. So
Yeah.
anyway, Harry gets his wand and he's wowed that he can wave it and make sparks come out. And he's like, I always had this sense that this was true. And, so that's sort of like the same feeling that Harry gets in the original books too.
I thought that was really interesting because at least to me it seemed like his, because then I think he describes like feeling the magic in his arm. Like it seemed like this kind of contrast to the other ways that he's been sort of processing these. I think like that one's kind of really visceral and gut level. Like he feels the thing happening, and so it's a level of like knowing a thing is true, not like we've been referring to a lot as like an observation. It's more than an observation. It's like a participation. It's an experience of the thing. I thought that was a really interesting way for him to, and it almost feels like it sounded like it almost bothered him in a way. Or that it was both. He was both sort of fascinated and impressed by it, but also that it was like it almost bothered him that there was this like power inside him that he hadn't understood before. I thought that was really interesting. It felt like it was a real big kind of contrast to the other ways he's been kind of discovering this new magicalness to himself.
Yeah, I didn't read that it bothered him, but I did read that it made it more personal.
Yeah.
Like when he had the bag of holding and he was doing science on it, that's different than like I'm making magic happen. Um, there's not the same sort of thing that we can do without instruments or something, as far as Muggle, us being Muggle scientists. Actually, no, there kind of is. Like my first Hello World program, like the, I guess I'll keep the aside very brief, but like I didn't start anything into programming until I was in my late 20s. And right up until I started learning, my whole understanding of it was, oh, coding is this opaque black box of mystery, and only people who've been coding since they were, in diapers can do this, and there's just no way for anyone to pick this up. And
That's because we're wizards.
well, it turns out that it's learnable by any adult who wants to spend a little time learning the very basics and a lot of time getting good. But
Reinstalling everything.
yeah, but yeah, exactly. But so like the difference between learning about how computer programs work and then writing your own, maybe that's the difference. Like I'm doing this and I get it now is maybe sort of what he's feeling there. It's the closest I can get to discovering magic anyway.
Yeah, let me read as we're talking about it more. It's more interesting that so this is what he said as he was doing it. That he had felt the magic pouring up his arm, and in that instant realized that he had always had that sense, that he had possessed it his whole life. The sense it was not sight or sound or smell or taste or touch, but only magic. Like having eyes but keeping them always closed so that you didn't even realize that you were seeing darkness. And then one day the eye opened and saw the world. The shock of it had poured through him, touching pieces of himself, awakening them, and then died away in seconds. So yeah, I felt it was very, very different from the other ways Harry's been kind of taking in all these changes.
Yeah,
So
he has right above that the I can do magic. Me, as in me personally, I am magical.
yeah,
It's a much more like personal exploration of it rather than just him abstractly analyzing stuff.
yeah.
And then it moves on to the next thing, which I think is the line from the original book. And it's very curious indeed that you should be destined for this wand when its brother, why, its brother gave you that scar. Okay, that could not possibly be a coincidence. There had been thousands of wands in that shop. Well, okay, it could be coincidences. But Bayes' theorem said that any reasonable hypothesis which made it more likely than 1,000 to 1 that he'd ended up with the brother to the Dark Lord's wand was going to have an advantage. What he's saying is, like, it could be a coincidence, but if there's 1,000 to 1 odds, I'm gonna assume it's not a coincidence. And Professor McGonagall
I can kind of relate to this weird way his like thoughts are like jumping around. Like he just got told something about the wand causing him a scar, and then he's jumping to like calculating. Well, if there's thousands to 1, and there's 1,000,000 people, and 6 billion people divide by 1,000 carry the 1, and then and Bayes' theorem, and blah 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 blah, and the dark light. Like his brain is just ricocheting.
Yeah, I think he's trying to come to grips with it, but also just trying to say, okay, could this be a coincidence? Because McGonagall's reaction was, how peculiar, and that was it. And you'd pulled this out, like the sheer overwhelming uncuriosity of wizards and witches. In no imaginable world would Harry have just went, and walked out of the shop without even trying to come up with a hypothesis for what was going on, which might have been a dig at the original one. I can't remember how he reacted to learning that it was Voldemort's brother's
Although
wand.
now that we're going through it again, it's like, the reasons how curious is more about like, let's just not talk about that because we don't want to be bringing up the Voldemort thing.
Yeah.
I didn't get that the first read through.
That's probably a big part of it, and I think
Yeah.
certainly maybe not in front of other people. Like Harry knows, well, I guess everybody knows that whatever Voldemort died, because I mean even the guy said it, its brother gave you that scar, but she clearly doesn't want to go into it, and he takes that as her just not
yeah,
really caring.
You'd think Ollivander would have known better than to like bring that up.
Yeah. And then she's like, you're a full wizard, congratulations. And what do you think of the wizarding world? And he's like, it's strange. I ought to be thinking about everything I've seen of magic, everything I know is possible, and everything I now know to be a lie, and all the work left before me to understand it. And yet I found myself distracted by relative trivialities like the whole boy who could live thing.
And he's like figuring out a way to refer to it in code.
Yeah. So she ahemed, and really, you don't say. He's like, yeah, it's just odd to find out you're part of this grand story, the quest to defeat the great and terrible Dark Lord, and then it's already done, finished, completely
that's a
over
good
with.
part, yeah.
Like you're Frodo Baggins, and you found out that your parents took you to Mount Doom, and you had to toss the ring in when you were 1 year old, and don't even remember it. And her smile had grown somewhat fixed.
Grown somewhat.
If I were anyone else, anyone at all, I'd probably be pretty worried about living up to that start. And then he's like, but I have hopes.
This is good. Like this is like a good part where he gets snarky again about it, and it works. It's the kind of good kind of snarky, I guess, because we don't take it nearly as seriously. But
Yeah.
that was a good funny bit.
And I think too, he's thinking.
But yeah, then he's starting to like he's basically almost starting to recite like a plot summary of the original Harry Potter. Like, oh, that would be ridiculous. Like, oh, and what if the Dark Lord's not dead and I'm part of some like prophecy and blah blah blah. And he's stating as ridiculous the things that, having read it, we know are already true. And McGonagall's just trying how on the nose he's being.
Right.
It's like, oh shit, like somebody who told you about a prophecy and
And this is because he's not, he hasn't read the Harry Potter books, but he's read all the other fantasy novels. And the Harry Potter books, while being, a wonderful, I guess, what do you call it, teen fantasy or whatever the genre, but they weren't super original. Like the plot, hey, you're the kid with the prophecy about him to, save the world or whatever. Like that's the tried and true trope, so he's very familiar with it. So he's pretending like his life is a story again, and then she's kind of like trying not to give anything away.
and it's funny to hear it as a retelling, like a third hand account of the book that we're already a part of. Let me read it. It's pretty funny the way he says it. He sighed, scrubbing his palm over his head. Or maybe the Dark Lord didn't really die that night. Not completely. His spirit lingers, whispering to people in nightmares that bleed over into the waking world, searching for a way back into the living lands he swore to destroy. And now, in accordance with the ancient prophecy, he and I are locked in a deadly duel where the winner shall lose and the loser shall win. I mean, it's awesome because it's like this. It's like making fun of Harry Potter at the same time. Or it's like, how could we describe Harry Potter in the most, cliched way possible?
Well, and a lot of fantasy novels too. I mean,
Yeah.
my
I guess it's another way. It's like this, winking at the camera that totally works. And it's kind of a cool where it's like it's like making fun of it in a way that like lets us know that we love it.
exactly, and he's just reciting tried and true tropes, and then she kind of freaks out and looks around, and he's like, "Look, I'm joking, Professor. Why did adults have to take everything so seriously?" And then a sinking sensation began to dawn in the pit of Harry's stomach, and she looks at him with a very calm expression, a very, very calm expression. Of course you are, Mr. Potter. Ah, crap.
Oh crap, that was a good line.
Uh,
He's like, oh shit, everything I just said is true.
yeah. And then, oh, he's not dead, is he?
And he's like, oh, and there's not a prophecy, is there? And she doesn't even say anything. He's like, ah.
You've got to be kidding me. And he's like, oh, I can't imagine why I thought he was dead. Clearly, I've much left to learn about the art of proper pessimism. And then he says, are you actually going to tell me about what's going on? And, imagine my reaction later when I found out that there was something to worry about after all. And her fixed smile falters, and he says, I have a whole I have a whole world of magic to analyze. I do not have time for this. Which is, that's just sort of a fun thing, because like the hero in a book would be like, great, I get to live up to this and whatever, but he's just like, I didn't want to be in a book. I wanted to figure this out. Which to be fair, he's not self-aware that he's in a book. He's not doing fourth wall stuff, but he's realizing like, oh, this is, I guess, how things are going.
And she goes back to a valid point. She's like, dude, you are 11 years old. You are not supposed to have to deal with this stuff. And that's where we kind of bump into again that like Harry's this sort of, the English major in me would say preternaturally, mature and intelligent. And so he's trying to take all this stuff on, and she's trying to bring it back to, a sanity check of, you are 11 years old. We are the grown-ups. You're not supposed to have to worry about these things.
And he's like, oh yeah, and I'm therefore subhuman. Sorry, I forgot. And she's trying to, express to him that they're secret, and that, it's a catastrophe that you know this much and you can't tell anyone. And
yeah, and then he just like locks onto, he's like, by God, she is going to tell me the whole story. And that turns into this contest of wills between Harry and McGonagall. And then this part like disturbed me, and I'm again not sure how I'm supposed to react to it, but because Harry just decides like, okay, she's going to tell me, and he knows that she doesn't want to, and so he starts calculating like, how am I going to get her to tell me? And so he rattles off this list of like, okay, I could try appealing to reason. Okay, that's not going to work. I can't remember. He goes through all these steps. I could, appeal to justice. I could say that I'll be in danger if she doesn't tell me, kind of listing off all of these approaches he might take and ruling them out. And there was something about, and then he like decides on like, oh, he's going to like basically bargain with her, and she ends up using the word blackmail. I wasn't clear. So he basically says like, you tell me or I'm going to out your secret. And I couldn't quite, like, I'm not really sure like what secret was he referring to, just that he's going to jump up and down and yell, hi, I'm Harry Potter, or that, oh no, he's saying, if you don't tell me about it, I'm going to tell everybody that Voldemort is still alive.
Yeah,
that was his.
That's the secret that he's referring to. And I liked you pulled out just a one a one sentence response to that is
Yeah.
like, what a sociopath.
Yeah, it was because there was. Let me read the part that like got that reaction on me. He says, "Well then, Professor," Harry said in a low, icy tone, "it sounds like I have something you want. You can, if you like, tell me the truth, the whole truth, and in return I will keep your secrets. Or you can try to keep me ignorant so you can use me as a pawn, in which case I will owe you nothing." And so it's like, implying these threats. It was just very like, he sort of like coldly decided on this goal that he's going to tell her about it for sort of vague reasons around he, quote, must know. But that he's like so willing to kind of burn the building down in order to find out and kind of, burn any sort of interpersonal trust he has with her in order to kind of get his way on this one thing. It was creepy the way he was kind of willing to just go, and that's the word I think is like sociopath. It became all about like achieving this goal of getting her to tell him what's going on, and not caring about any interpersonal cost of the whole thing, and how he just kind of goes through calculating around. This is the part that seemed very like, it's a word that get overused, but the sociopath part of it was he was calculating the different ways he could try to win this argument with her, and calculating her reactions to any way he might approach it as just this sort of like cause effect calculation, rather than like, okay, he's talking to another person.
Yeah, and he eventually settles, instead of like appealing to friendship or fairness, he goes straight to blackmail. And I think
Yeah.
upon rereading this too, it seems like the blackmail wasn't just outing that Voldemort was alive, but that McGonagall knew and she kept it secret, and she told me, which makes it a personal blackmail on her.
Yeah.
And, again, on rereading this too, I think it makes sense then to have literally his freak out about needing to be responsible, needing to be the one in charge earlier in this chapter, because I think the reason that he's so desperate to know is because, as he considers during his sort of sociopathic analysis of how to go about this with her, that plans have already been made based on your ignorance, and the responsible adults are handling this. He's like, no, fuck it, I'm the responsible one. I'm not going to let them try and take care of this. I'm going to be informed so I can actually be autonomous here. Mm-hmm. Which is consistent with his whole neurotic preparation that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, it's like, okay, this is a thing I must know because then I will be able to figure out a way to prevent all bad things.
Right. And then more sociopathically, she's like, you would blackmail me? And Harry's lips twisted. I'm offering you a favor. I'm giving you a chance to protect your precious secret. If you refuse, I'll have every natural motive to make inquiries elsewhere, not to spite you, but because I have to know. Get past your pointless anger at a child who you think ought to obey you, and you'll realize that any sane adult would do the same. Look at it from my perspective. How would you feel if it was you?
This part, it's reminding me of, blanking on the name. The book with the child pilot.
Oh, Ender's Game.
It's a really Ender's Game. So this part, it reminds me of Andrew Wiggin from Ender's Game, where he's this like weirdly cruel but overly like mature, but also believably still a child about the way he's acting. The whole thing is super creepy. Where he just like turns into this very sort of manipulative, bargaining, and the way he's sort of characterizing his blackmailing is that he's offering her a favor, which is just clearly not true. The whole thing's really disturbing.
Yeah, it's like holding a gun to someone's head. It's like, no, I'm offering you a favor. You can give me the money in your pocket, and in exchange, I won't give you this bullet. But yeah, it's a fair bet that he's read Ender's Game. Maybe that's where he picked this up.
Yeah.
So he kind of lets off the pressure and says, you don't have to decide right away. I'll understand if you want time to think about my offer, but let's see. He does have this.
I know, it's always so creepy when intentionally mischaracterizing what you're saying. It sort of causes this like unsettling cognitive dissonance for me. It's like, it's not an offer, you're threatening, or don't understand what you're saying.
Yeah, he's being scary for sure. And I'll pull this out because it's a fun little thing that I've done for myself. So he says, and don't try that obliviation spell on me. Some time ago I worked out a signal, and I've already sent that signal to myself. If I find that signal and I don't remember sending it, then her face kind of shifts, and I wasn't thinking of obliviating you, Mr. Potter, but why would you have invented such a signal if you didn't know about... Well, I thought about it while reading a Muggle science fiction book, and I said to myself, well, just in case.
Just in case. Now, was he was lying at this point, right? Like, he's just making up that he made a signal.
That actually would
Because it's
work.
because like
I
yeah, because it's not because he didn't like we didn't plant that as a thing that had happened any earlier, and it just sounds like this weirdly again it like fit as him being like manipulative
it would
and weird.
it
Like
might jump out on a second read if you were going through this right when they talk about, or right after he concludes that the Dark Lord must be alive, and before he starts blackmailing her, he bites his lip so hard that it bleeds.
oh, and that's
That
that was on
it
purpose.
seems like it.
Huh.
Yeah, and it's funny because the way that I relate this to myself is I years ago, maybe I think it was before reading this, but I invented a passphrase that only I know, so that if I ever were to be confronted by someone who claimed to be my like identical clone or a me from the future, I could get past the whole like "Are you really me?" thing with just a one sentence dialogue. So I like that he
So
he
that'll
had a
come in
similar
handy.
thing. Oh, it doesn't necessarily come in handy. All he did was bite his lip, but I like that because I just saw the
No, I was saying you've got that squared away for when
it,
your doppelganger is trying to impersonate you.
exactly. And I've been trying to work on one
So
with
you,
my wife so that if we're ever in a
so you
situation
got that
like in
going
all the
for you.
movies where she has to shoot me or the robot, then I can, tell her which one's the robot. We've worked out stealth signals if one of us is secretly in danger, but uh, but um, see, it's not neurotic. It's just being prepared, and it's also kind of fun. But so like there was a show I just watched on Netflix with Paul Rudd called Living with Yourself. And the premise given away in the trailer is that there's a clone of him that seems to be better than him in every way. But at the beginning, anyway, of the story, they're trying to figure out, like, is this really me? They're going over each other's memories, that sort of stuff. But I could save myself an hour and just have myself for the passwords. So, anyway, so let's see.
You could just ask you to log into your computer.
Exactly. Perfect. I like this. We've got the last big part here to cover, and then that's about it. But so he gives her time to think about the signal, or about the generous offer that he's given her, and she offers a concession to him, and she had said, okay, look, it won't help you to go around asking about this. There are only two other people in the world who know about this, and it's Headmaster Albus Dumbledore and Professor Severus Snape.
And he's like, aha, more information.
He sees that as a peace offering. Yeah, exactly. More information.
Yeah.
So he knows better than just go running around Diagon Alley and asking people. So then she's like, okay. She looked very old and very tired. And this has been an exhausting day, Mr. Potter. Can we get your trunk and send you home? And he's like, so now I've got to kill an immortal dark wizard. He sighed in frustration. I really wish you told me that before I started shopping. I wonder how much more paranoid he could have been walking through the streets if he probably would have taken out $500 more and just loaded his trunk with everything he could think of. But that's just a funny kind of levity note. And then there's another line break to signal that we're changing gears here.
So then we're off to him buying the trunk. So that's yet another store that we're in. Did this? I guess that's what I got unnecessarily stuck on. Was there? There was no trunk anything in the original books, was there? I mean, he has a trunk, but there was nothing special about it.
No, not his trunk. Maybe Malfoy had a nice trunk or something. I'm trying to think if there's anything with like an extension charm in the original series, because
Yeah. Well, so yeah, Hermione had basically a bag. It's kind of like Felix the Cat's magic bag. It was basically the same thing. You could store like way too much stuff in it.
okay.
But I was trying. I think Harry's trunk. Yeah, Harry's trunk was just this thing he dragged around. There wasn't anything magical about it.
And this is where I'm at with my years of separation from the original series and Methods of Rationality, that I can't remember if Malfoy had a magic trunk with more space on the inside than the outside in the regular books, or if it was in this one or what. But
I don't think so. Yeah, I think if there was just Hermione's bag, I think was the only thing that did the magical size changing stuff.
well, I guess this one's a bigger outside item, so it's got a bigger inside item, and it's described as having enough
Yeah.
room for 12 bookcases. And yeah, oh yeah,
And he says, "Why would I don't understand why anybody would buy a house if
Right.
there's trunks like this."
which would be super cool. Maybe this could just be the
That sort
author
of
inventing
reminds me
stuff
of,
that
like-
sounds super awesome, right?
That reminds me of the same kind of logic where there's been like Google employees that have just decided to save money by just living in a van in the Google parking lot, even though they're making like six figures.
Right. Oh, you know what? There is something like this in the
That's
original
very
story where when they go to the World Quidditch Cup, the Weasleys' tent that they borrow is like this lavish place on the inside, but
Oh,
it's a
yeah,
tent on
yeah.
the outside.
Yeah.
So this technology existed in the regular books, but it was never utilized. But I think just because Eliezer Yudkowsky is more interested in, I guess, taking things a little further and like just like in the art of munchkining, to use the D&D style phrase, just like man, if you can make a tent like that, why wouldn't there be more stuff than this? And oh man, how cool would that be? So I think this is one of those things. But the important part of this exchange isn't just that he gets this dope ass trunk; it's that it costs 97 galleons. Or no, wait, it cost 100 and
No, he only has 97 guns.
yeah.
Now, I guess, yeah, so it costs 108 and he's only got 97 left. Now, did he think, it sounds like he thought that McGonagall intentionally had him not have enough money to buy the thing? I mean, she definitely wants, she's like, oh, we can't afford it, let's go. And she's like, oh, phew, now we don't have to buy a trunk.
I don't know. She says that it's her fault, and she would take him back to Gringotts if she could, but they're closed. And no, she seems like,
I mean,
well,
she
we might
definitely
as well
sounds like
go.
she's like not at all disappointed.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if she was trying to keep him from getting one. It's hard to see what more trouble he can get into with a trunk than he could with a pouch. But I think it was more just like her being, well, oh well, that sucks. And they don't raise the option of like, okay, cool, I'll send you money tomorrow and I'll order one, or even ask him to borrow money from Professor McGonagall. But it doesn't come to that. So what happens is they go to leave, or she goes to kind of signal that they should go, and
She's like, oh yeah, we're leaving. And he's like, wait a minute. And then he gets in this whole, he's like, what if, I don't think he exactly puts it this way, but he's like, what if I happen to have extra money lying around? And so he basically talks her into like, you promise not to get mad. She's like, okay, fine. And so he like pulls money out of his magic bag of tricks. I wasn't clear because he says, he just calls for it like in the same way that he can, ask for anything out of the bag. So he says like 12 galleons from my vault or something like that. I did 11 galleons originally from my family vault. Did I get it that he was like able to like teleport money out of his vault with his bag?
no, that was her interpretation as well.
Or was, okay.
So
did he was trying to lead her to believe that's what he could do?
I think just for a second, he goes on to explain what he does. So he asks her, basically, hey, look, I'm not trying to, challenge you or whatever, but if I could have made today go better, would you be okay with that? Or would you be pissed because I'm a kid? And, so then he says, okay, so suppose I had a way to get more galleons from my vault without us having to go back to Gringotts. Would that be me being disobedient, or would you, and you would punish me, or would that be okay because this is what we need right now? And
Oh, actually, so he says actually that so that it's not that it can teleport out of his vault, but that he said that I ought to just lie to you and tell you that my pouch can teleport things out of the vault.
because he discovered the
And then
true
he
secrets
admits it.
of it, and then
Yeah.
she asks him how, and
he's like, nah, not really. He's just like, I palmed a bunch of money in the vault when you weren't looking.
right. But I liked that when she says, how, and he's like, magic. That's hardly an answer. And so
He's like, I know.
she feels his frustration. He explains that, yeah, I grabbed some because I thought, hey, money is important to have around because that's just proper pessimism. And, are you pissed that I defied your authority? Or can we be glad that we succeeded in our important mission? And the salesman is impressed. And
And they finally get the trunk.
yeah, but then she's just like, discipline has to be enforced at school, but fine. So then they get it, and he goes through this, and it took me a few minutes of thinking about this to figure out why. But he's like, all right, let me go use the restroom really quick, because he feels like he's going to be sick, and he's like covered in sweat. I'm like, that seems like kind of over the top, but I think my read on it
And I was
is
supposed
that
is it just that he was overwhelmed by having had to basically, strong arm her into doing it? I was also puzzled by it.
I think it was because he didn't seem like he was going to sweat and, throw up from uncomfortableness when he was being sociopathic earlier, right? Because he wasn't really being a kid. The only way that this makes sense to me is like, imagine if I had a conversation like this with my boss, where I'm like, okay, look, remember how you said this would work and it's not? Well, let's pretend like I didn't believe you before and I actually did the thing that I wanted to do and it works because I didn't listen to you. Is that okay? That's the only thing I have in my life right now that resembles a student-teacher relationship, but I think that's why he's freaking out is that he's
He's
defied.
super close to getting busted.
Yeah, or no, I think because he basically asked, like, can I defy your authority and not get in trouble? But yeah, so he cleans up and they leave. So
Yeah. And then it seems like they sort of like make nice. Like we can tell we're sort of like wrapping up this whole Diagon Alley interaction.
Yeah, it's wrapping it up. We're leaving the area. The she complains that her day was surreal, and he's like, "Oh, you think your day was surreal? Try mine." And she says, "Thank you. If you had been sorted into the house, I'd have deducted so many points that your grandchildren would still be losing the house cup. Thank you, Professor. It was probably too early to start calling her Minnie."
He did say, he said to her like right before that, he's like, I was very impressed with you today.
Yeah.
like he wanted to make sure that she knew that she did a good job.
Which is sort of a weird thing to say, and he even
Yeah.
goes on to make it weirder and says, "I was awarding you points in my head and everything," which, having encountered somebody telling me that, I don't know, a month ago, and she's in her 30s, it was like, so one of my coworkers like, "Oh man, that's a lot of points from me," or like, "You just got a lot of points from me," or something, and I was like, "Oh, you keep scores of people in your head too, but I don't usually talk about it." But
You're not supposed to tell them.
yeah, we don't tell people that we're keeping score. It's a secret we all keep. Oh, but this was nice. He goes to surrender his wand, and she's like, "Oh no, we don't do that. I was just letting you know that
Yeah.
the ministry can detect underage magic, and it's prohibited without supervision." And it's fun because like one reading of Harry would be like, "Oh man, they're trying to keep me down or whatever," but I like it because he's like, "Oh, that sounds like a really sensible rule. I'm glad that the Wizarding World takes that seriously," and I take that with all sincerity from him because he's not just about being in charge. He's about having sensible things, right? So, and it would be one thing maybe if they had said, magic doesn't work if you're off premises or something, or if you're underage. That might piss him off. But it's just like, oh no, it's against the law. And he's like, oh, that's fine. That's great. That's a really good idea.
Yeah.
Because you can break the law in an emergency, but so it doesn't take away his autonomy, but it does make it like a reasonable restriction to have.
And then we get this like right at the end, this like foreshadowing into coming plot advances that McGonagall just sort of cryptically says, "Hey, go look for Hermione Granger," and he's like, "Who? What?" And then she won't tell him. She's just like, "Dun dun dun."
Oh yeah, he turns around and she's gone.
Yeah.
So yeah, wonder what that's about. And then there's a
And then we go to commercial, and then after coming back from commercial, in the next episode of HPMOR.
Oh, actually, well, there's the short
It's
aftermath,
McGonagall
which is
and
kind of
Dumbledore,
funny,
yeah.
where
Yeah.
she's reporting to.
That's it. Totally played like coming back from commercial for like the last 10-second like outro of the,
No, it was great.
of the episode. That's how it played.
Yeah.
And I guess it's the first time we see Dumbledore.
Yes. And she's like, "So how did you find Harry?" And she opens her mouth, then closes it, then opens it, and no words came out. And he's just like, "I see. Thank you for your report. You can go."
I liked how that left it though. It was like, okay, now we're gonna really start getting into like we're gonna get into Hogwarts, like we're gonna start introducing more characters and like we're ratcheting all that up. So I liked how that sort of added momentum to where the story's going.
Yeah, and it's nice to get some, I don't know, higher level foreshadowing stuff. It's also just funny that she couldn't, like, she's just still baffled by the day and she couldn't describe it. And he's just like, "Okay, I get it. It was weird. Thanks. That's a good report."
That's good. That's a good description. That about sums it up.
So,
Well, cool.
yeah, man. I guess the only other couple things we got here is, so the chapter is called The Planning Fallacy. It was pointed out to me by Inyash, actually, that when he was doing the audiobook, that he noticed after recording each one that then he'd go put the name on the episode and post it, that the name always actually made a lot of sense for what happened in the episode. And the way that my reader works on my phone, if I like hit the smart reader, it just grabs the text. It doesn't usually grab like stuff at the top that looks superfluous, so it doesn't really show the chapter. So I didn't get. Anyway, he brought that to my attention, so I thought that'd be something to look at for maybe all the chapters if they're all interesting. But
Yeah, if there's a they have tied in. I mean, this has been what this chapter was all about. Basically, if you read from the planning fallacy as Harry's neurotic and is trying to control his whole little world, then that's totally what this chapter has been all about.
So that actually brings up another thing I wanted to do, and I think that part of what this book's trying to aim for is to make the reader know what Harry knows as far as the techniques of rationality and cognitive science. So given that, can you, after having read this, Brian, tell me what the planning fallacy is?
What is the planning? Well, that's what he was talking about with that we're overly optimistic, that everybody assumes that everything is going that. Well, it's like a probability multiplication that if you're extrapolating how you think 10 things are going to go and they all have a 90% chance of going the way you think, then it's going to be 90% chance of it going the way you think, but it's really zero point 0.9 times zero point 0.9 times zero point 0.9. And so if 9 out of 10 times it's going to go right, and if you've got 10 of them, one of them is going to go wrong. Probably. So, and that was sort of like how we kind of enlarged that to the whole idea was that, people think that nothing's ever going to go wrong because when they think of any individual situation, it's usually fine.
That was really well put.
Did I get that right?
I think so.
There you go.
Yeah, I think that was perfect. That's the planning fallacy. People assume everything goes well, and like you said, they assume everything goes well for all the steps, and they multiply wrong because we're not good at multiplication, right? So yeah, perfect. Technique successfully taught. I should make a list.
Excellent.
So this is fun because, and I wrote this in the notes here just because this is one of my one of the easiest things to notice when you're and you do this at work. I'm assuming if you're in sprint planning or even in a feature planning meeting or something, and they're laying out, okay, well, this shouldn't take more than a couple of days, and this should probably take half a day tops. And if it's a good team with good management, you can say, you know what, we need a buffer in there. Nothing's ever that easy, and especially if there's unknowns involved, right?
Yeah, it's round up, double it, and add 3.
I had one architect put it to me one time that, oh yeah, you just double the number and then increment it by a unit. So if you think it'll take 1 hour, it'll take 2 days, which is probably overdoing it. But so I grabbed a few examples of real world planning fallacy stuff because some of especially the research that Harry cites is the cited research of this, which the drag of cognitive science research, which is actually what I got my degree in psychology, but it was focused on cognitive stuff. Less of the psychoanalysis and psychotherapy stuff and more cognitive psychology. And it's a bummer that really all the research that people do is done on, not all of it, but a large amount of it is done on college students because it's either grad students or professors doing the study and they can just make kids participate in them, right? So
I was part of that.
Yeah, me too. And I did one, and I can't remember even what we found if it would have been useful, but so there were a handful of real world examples that I thought were a lot of fun. And in fact, even on the Wikipedia page, well, I'll save it for last. I'll run down through the list really quick. So the Sydney Opera House was expected to be completed in 1963. A scaled down version opened in 1973, a decade later, and the original cost was estimated to be $7 million, but the delayed completion led to a total cost of $102 million. So it was a decade late and cost $100 million more than they expected. The Eurofighter Typhoon defense project took 6 years longer than expected and overrun cost by 8 billion euros. The Boston Central Artery was completed 7 years later than planned, costing another 12 billion.
Seems like construction and computer programming have very similar problems.
Yeah. That sounds about, they're kind of the same thing, right?
Yeah. We like to tell ourselves.
They're what?
We like to tell ourselves that.
There's parallels. I think that's probably the case for any large-scale planning thing. But the other one that made the list on Wikipedia was the Denver International Airport, which opened 16 months later than scheduled, with a total cost of $4.8 billion, but that was $2 billion over expectations.
I remember that. It was all about the luggage conveyors.
I remember that being a big thing that they had to do at least a couple of times. But then there was just last year they finally opened up, I think, the G line that runs to Arvada. And that was 2 years delayed, and I have no idea what the cost was above what they expected, but I'm sure it was higher. But yeah, the point is this thing happens all the time. So what I like about the planning fallacy as it relates to just the cognitive phenomena that people experience is that we can observe real world things of this happening all the time. You don't even have to have a job where this is involved. You can just look at any big project that's happening in your city, and especially one that was done 5 years ago, and then look up what it was supposed to cost and see how long it actually took and what it costs. So rather than just being college students guessing on when they'll finish their term paper, this was actual real world stuff. So yeah, man, that's all I got for this one.
Cool.
Any other final thoughts or notes on this one?
No, I'm curious to see where it goes. I keep going back and forth on how much I like or dislike Harry. So we'll see where we end up.
Well, that'll be fun. Mm-hmm. I think I do like. Obviously, I like the protagonist. I've liked this book. I've read it a few times. So read/listened too. So I think I'm biased, but it's nice to, that's the whole point. See what an objective person coming into this feels about it, and maybe he gets more likable. Maybe we just get to like him more. Who knows? So.
Well, anyway, and if part of this is us working through those things, that can be super interesting.
Yeah.
If we're watching how does Harry work through these, weird control freak things, and his wishing that adults would stop treating him like an 11-year-old. And
Yeah, we'll have to see how it goes,
so it
man.
just depends on what we do with it. Yeah.
And I can tell you that I think since chapter 6 took us a whole episode, chapter 7 definitely will too. It's about as long, and there's a lot to cover
it's
there.
even longer,
So
yeah.
we'll be back next week with chapter 7.
Alrighty.
Awesome.